Who am I? What is I? I see the world, but the world already is, so does it matter what I see? From a very young age, I remember sitting in my dining room playing with my toys, and one memory in particular stood out. I had one of those Little Tikes rideable plastic bikes with 3 wheels, but I got tired of using it like a bike. I used to spin the singular wheel and pretend I was a blacksmith sharpening tools. While I was doing that, I was conjuring feelings of productivity, and those thoughts created new feelings. As I was imagining myself being creative and I started to create new feelings, I would categorize those feelings that didn't have names. I even automatically associate feelings with colors, and I do the same thing with people as well. But to this day, I don't have names for some of the soft, dreamy, dreary, content feelings I came upon when I was younger, but they come up every now and then. Long drives in the crisp fall air, 65 degrees, everything feels sharp and new, but also comfortable. I tuck that one liminal or ambiguous emotion in the manila folder under seasonal feelings. Meanwhile, somewhere in the gray of nostalgia and melancholia actually exists 2 colors, fuchsia and storm gray. Not quite red, not quite pink, not quite deep gray, but intense enough and dreary enough to evoke a poignant reminder of the past. I could give a few other examples, but I think the notion is starting to settle in. I don't think every one of you listening to this would interpret the world in the same way that I do, in colors, between lines, and never simple enough. Each and every one of us is a lens tuned to a specific degree, and that lens is our ego. Sigmund Freud defined our ego in 3 compartments. The id, which is the carnal, instinctual desire and drivers of our being. The ego, which is the sense of self, experiences, and our overall identity. And the superego, which helps solidify the ego with moral decision-making, which is rewarding the self for positive moral decisions and disciplining it for poor decisions. The id exists at the far right of our being, while the superego exists at the far left, and these terms are subject to each identity. In between, you're left with you, which is your ego. The right side drives your hunger, procreation, curiosity, and animal-like tendencies, while the left is adapted to higher reasoning and sorting out decisions and actions. When the left and the right are fighting, your ego steps in to mediate and leverages experiences to reach conclusions. However, when your ego is left with unresolved trauma or sheer uncertainty, it results in defense mechanisms. Repression, denial, and rationalization as examples to reduce stress and increase balance and stability. So, now that we brought up a crash course in Freudian theory, I want to touch on concepts of faith. Specifically, the ambiguous yet conclusive reasoning that helps absolve the self of decision-making. There are aspects of faith that guide egotistical behavior and bypass the superego. In other words, because my great deity said this thing, I believe in it, and there is no room for argument and others are wrong. Alternatively, there are others that use faith as a platform above the ego, but it is still moderated by the superego. This testament of this passage is very cruel, but my deity said it is virtuous and righteous. I don't know if I agree with that. I don't think I will believe in that. The dissonance between these 2 trains of thought cause those with doubt, lack of clarity, lack of perspective, lack of confidence, and so forth to resort to the ego's defenses: repression, denial, and rationalization. So now we've introduced this example of faith as a means to explore the solidified ego, cognitive dissonance, and defensive methods to address contrary information. Take this same exact theme and apply it to nature and nurture, society, and social constructs. Imagine a child raised in an average family home. Perhaps they have 2 to 3 siblings, a mother and a father, all under one house. This is your typical American dream family where the trad wife, or traditional wife, would stay at home, cook, clean, and take care of the kids. The father would go to work, come home, take care of mechanical chores, and also raise the kids where applicable. The mother plays the soft, nurturing role, while the father plays the stern, foundational support. But don't confound the 2 as lesser or greater in support. They are both critical in the child's development. The child encounters typical stressors like public school, bullying, getting a job, navigating life, losing a relationship, gaining one, death, loss, etc. However, throughout this process of the navigation of normal societal structures, there was enough balance in the formative years of said child that the stressors were taken in stride. This example isn't arguing exceptions or contingencies, but more so the rule. Proper balance creates better foundations. Now, take that average American family and remove one, or both, parents. If you decided to take away the mother, the feminine, nurturing, caring aspect of the balance that fosters emotional safety, emotional regulation, trust, and relationship building is severely impacted. If you remove the father, you remove the challenging, independent, adaptable, and critical thinking aspects of the masculine rigidity. Both parents provide safety, stability, and consistency, but in different ways that create balance. If you take both of them away, the child is forced to imprint upon whoever or whatever they are given and must raise themselves through trial and error, ultimately fueling their own adaptability and defensive rationalization over time. To add a bit more on the importance of parenting, there were 2 studies conducted with children less than 3 years old. One study was conducted by Edward Tronick, which is called the Still Face Experiment. I'd highly recommend finding the video for this on YouTube and watching it, but in short summary, a mother stared at their baby and the baby attempted every action it could to elicit a response from the mother. After failing, the baby broke down and cried. In another study at the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences within the University of Washington, a child was given puzzles to solve while 2 adults argued in the background. The child grew incredibly still and heavily moderated their behavior while they were arguing, as opposed to being playful and engaged while there was no conflict. Children have the capacity to interpret and internalize the stressors from caregivers and their environment and respond in the capacity that they're capable. It would be impossible to go over every theoretical scenario to fully comprehend how a person, or rather an identity, is born, but I hope from these examples we can further understand that the formative years of our identity is a culmination of our most profound emotional experiences across a timeline. If that timeline is mostly positive, there's balance there. If it's mostly negative, then there's a lot of difficulty to walk through in order to reach that balance. A good example of said balance is this. If you take a glass of water that is half full, or half empty, and add milk to the other half, you'll have to filter, strain, reduce, and possibly more to get the water that you wanted. In essence, it takes work to get the desired result. Depending on how someone was raised or what emotional experiences they encountered, they may not have the means to filter that milk out. Their ego chose the means and methods to protect them at times when they had no alternative to cope, and so they defaulted to what they knew to comfort them. Their resourcefulness, adaptability, and resilience, or pliability, is defined by their experiences, and subsequently the bounds of their ego. Presenting someone with conflicting information is not a comfortable process for either party. This could be politics, ethics, abuse, trauma, or any topic in between, but the notion is the same. Whether the substantiated fact you're presenting or the persuasive opinion you're carrying does not compute with the other party, you're left with a moot point. If the decision of the receiving party is to refute the substantiated evidence and instead choose their ego, or equivalently their pride, then they've chosen what comforts them over truth. As much as the plaintiff pleads their case to be true, and while it may be wildly accepted, the defendant has every right to deny what does not align with their perception of their world. The judge in this court of receipts lies in the individual. We cannot force them to see truth if truth is too difficult to comprehend. If their resourcefulness or their tools do not come with the means to digest the information, then the topic will be left on the floor. For some listeners, this might evoke a past experience where you've attempted to reason with a loved one, a friend, a brother, or a sister, and they chose a path contrary to the truth. The hurt and the pain may sit with you as an unresolved trauma as you're unable to comprehend why someone so close to you would opt to choose something contrary or otherwise themselves instead of your heartfelt case. Sadly, it boils down to, it's just what they know to be true. If I may provide a sense of solace and a segue to our next few points, it lies in some of my past reflection segments. While people are important, and while time, experiences, and actually living are valuable, we cannot control anything external to us. Sometimes the truth you attempt to convey must transform into the love you choose to let go in peace. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, once wrote in his work titled Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." This same notion is repeated throughout many faiths and practices, to which I'd like to explore a bit more and convey it a few levels deeper, but not so deep as to make your eyes glaze over, because this stuff can get pretty exhaustive. In the realm of faith, I'd like to bullet point some concepts from Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, or Taoism, Native American culture, Japanese culture, Stoicism, humanism, and Transcendentalism. There are nuances across each practice that I couldn't possibly expand on in this segment since they run very deep, and even if I did, we'd be very far down a rabbit hole and we'd find difficulty circling back. In my everyday career, it's my job to cut straight through the middle and find the most repeatable truths that help businesses to run. After reading through so much material on my own, I keep seeing some of these same truths mirrored again and again throughout each practice. There are even beliefs and practices like perennialism and theosophy that have come across this notion as well. I also want to stress that I'm not an expert in any of these subjects, and I hope that this reflection doesn't come across as me being an authority. A lot of what I've reflected on and what I've personally come to realize without research, I later ended up learning that these concepts very much aligned in my own epiphanies and already existed. However, I don't necessarily align with any individual practice. If you find any of these practices interesting and you want to learn more, I'd recommend doing some research on them. In Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, it's acknowledged that the ego, or me, is an illusion. The constant chase and grasping at a sense of self or self-centeredness is a pointless endeavor that fuels suffering. The ego is a tool, like the lens I mentioned earlier, that helps us navigate life and helps us survive. Across each of the mentioned practices and cultures, there is a mention of a oneness and an interconnected dependence that flows throughout the universe. No singular thing is created independently of its own accord. This thought bleeds into the scientific energy conservation theory, which states energy cannot be created or destroyed, but transformed. In Zen Buddhism within Japan, the term mu translates to nothingness or absence. In Japanese culture, absence, or space between, is commonplace and depicted in artistic practices like Zen gardens, poetry like haiku, and even minimalist architecture. Similar understandings are seen in Hinduism and Buddhism from a term called shunyata, and excuse me if my pronunciations suck, which means nothingness. This understanding/philosophy drives the concept of impermanence devoid of self-identity. This also feeds into the concept of interconnectedness or oneness. Stoicism, humanism, and transcendentalism are practices that also focus on oneness and interconnectivity, but leaning more towards the human soul. There exists an innate belief in the goodness of humanity, connectivity, and responsibility to nature, and that we as humans can continue to evolve or self-actualize and be better. There are many nuances and details that I haven't gone into that make each of these practices unique. There are even deeper, more compounded isms that I haven't mentioned of practices that follow these lines of thinking, and there are many tangents that can be followed to reinforce this line of thinking. But there's a very clear line that drives through them and a story to derive from each of them. The ego does not matter. There is a higher, more existential purpose that is greater than the self, that is tied to living, experiencing, and supporting your fellow man. The materialistic lives we lead are a result of being trapped in an industrial, capitalistic society of our own making. While it's true that we must drown ourselves in the day-to-day of that vicious cycle, it's important to remember that coming up for air means to live in a higher purpose beyond social and physical survival. Going back to me as a kid, and I may have mentioned this in a prior segment, but I've lost cohesion at this point doing all this reading and research. There was this one girl in particular, we'll call her E, who was pretty relentless for several years. I remember early on when she first started, she told me verbatim, "You should just kill yourself, no one would miss you." And at the time, being a child with zero perspective, you tend to believe what others tell you when they don't give you any time to form your own opinion. So that was my truth for a long time. I was worthless. But one thing I kept circling back to in my logical mind, and something that didn't quite hit the eureka point for me in my child brain, was asking myself, why me? I didn't get why I was being singled out, but regardless, there was something I was doing or saying that was drawing attention to myself. Coming full circle and recognizing my place then versus now, I realized it was because I wasn't doing what everyone else was. I never tried to fit in, and I didn't care, yet other people forced their perspectives on me and drove me into submission. Later on in life, I had to forcibly learn traits like fashion, social skills, and other criteria to fit in, thinking they were necessary to integrate. So, from a societal perspective, I was a late bloomer. The entire time I spent learning and acquiring these skills, I was still extremely confused and wondered why any of it mattered, and I was suffering trying to figure it out. Harping on the question, why me, isn't productive because it's inherently self-pitiful. It's nothing but a phrase that induces suffering and a tirade of questions on self-inadequacy, which inherently does not matter. What hit me later was the realization that it holds a stronger meaning. Why me? Why does I matter? Myself, a child, was not able to conceptualize the purpose of identity, and was confused and depressed for many years, attempting to find what others told me I had lost. What had never occurred to me was that I was being singled out and attacked for others' insecurity because I already had what others didn't: a secure, happy lack of self. The reason I'm sharing this personal anecdote is to connect the concept of identity with trauma. Trauma is an external force done to us, and we cannot control what is done to us, but we can control how we respond. Trauma is a pivotal, hurtful point that we struggle to reason with, and it's etched as a scar into our psyche and ego. When we encounter a roadblock, it's up to our higher functions to find ways around, or give up and wait for help. The giving up is our defense mechanisms kicking in: repression, denial, and rationalization. Those who cannot repress will deny, and those who cannot deny will rationalize. For those who can't achieve either of the three, and the damage is too great, they create more problems for themselves in the pursuit to soothe the scathed ego. People that are so entrenched in trauma can even develop CPTSD and other mental illnesses where their pain slowly starts to take over their identity. Unhealthy methods of coping can be drugs, sex, violence, disassociation, or avoidance, to name a few. We conjure distractions, vices, or habits when mental defenses can't cope with the barrage of pain. For example, porn addiction stems from a deep lack of connection and great self-conflict. Loneliness, coupled with the unknown self, flocks to physical intimacy when the soul cannot get what it needs. We satiate a shadow thought in our subconscious, being the craving for connectivity, and fuel it from our desires in the id. Effectively, we ignore who we are to feed the animal we aren't. I've had to stop myself from going on several tangents in this reflection because there are so many rabbit holes to explore. This subject is the most fascinating out of all of them because the crux of the discussion hinges on personal ambition and incentive, all of which comes from personal discovery. It's almost like the shopping cart case. Do you leave the shopping cart in the parking lot, or do you put it back in the stall? What drives you to do either one? Why? When I look at people, I don't just see a body or a face. When I look for a partner, I don't see what they have or what they were given. I see that color I mentioned earlier, and that color comes with complexities and a sea of not-so-simple answers that they're puzzles to solve. Maybe that's my own unique nature, and I've been told I tend to look too deeply by a few people now. But it's who I am. A unique, complex, transitory color. While most people will leave you disappointed or dissatisfied, there are some worth breaking apart to know all there is. Even rarer still are those that want to return the favor. Perhaps the greatest epiphany I've learned in the coined term of ego death is, are you pursuing them for you, or are you pursuing them for them? I've reached a stage in my life where I've completed my self-discovery. I know my bounds, my limitations, my strengths and weaknesses. I know I'll continue to change as I embrace impermanence in life's final door, but it's my hope that those who can't find their way or don't know who they are can reach the same conclusions I have. It's taken years of introspection, pain, repeated lessons, and experiences to unlock these milestones that allow me to see through this illusion. I am, and I am not.